Hey guys, Spence here, and
Warning, the following footage will contain a lot of bugs, insects, and 6 and 8-legged creatures. If these things happen to make you uncomfortable, you have been warned. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, without further ado,
let's squash some bugs! So, Earth Defense Force 4.1, The Shadow of New Despair. The shorter version of this is basically in 2013, being developed by SANDLOT Studios and published by D3 Publisher. This game was released under the name of Earth Defense Force 2025 in Japan and then 1 year later in the Americas and Europe for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The game was then re-released as 4.1 in 2015 in Japan and also in the Americas in the same year, but Europe 1 year later, and the PC version 1 year later. But enough talking about the past, let's talk about the now, and see what exactly is going on in Earth Defense Force 4.1, The Shadow of New Despair. On a parallel future Earth in 2018, the Earth Defense Force, also known as the EDF, finally beat back the alien invaders referred to as the Ravagers, who had a very nasty habit of attacking the human race with giant bugs and insects, and even bigger giant robots. Flash forward 7 years, and the alien Ravagers are back with even more giant bugs and more giant robots, but the EDF is still around and was preparing for a second invasion, and now with improved equipment and soldiers, it's time to fight back against the alien threat once again. To say the game's plot is a secondary aspect to it is an understatement. Any plot-relevant information is only given out during the incredibly short cutscenes at the start of missions as voiceover, or as voiceover during the actual missions themselves. This game is about shooting giant monsters, and wants you to shoot giant monsters, and will not have you do anything else than shooting giant monsters. Some of the dialogue can be funny at times, but let's be honest, it's not a comedy show, and it's definitely not an epic. So don't expect anything from this plot other than to give you things to shoot at.
Ranger 1, report the situation.
We engaged with giant insects and defeated a number of them.
What did you say? That's impossible.
In the game, there will be 3 role modes you'll be playing. Mission mode, which will have single player and co-op for you and another buddy, and online mission mode, which will allow you and 3 other people to go out into the world and save it from giant bugs together! Oh, and versus mode, in case you want to shoot at some humanoid targets, but no one's going to be doing that. Mission mode and online mission mode will have you going through the missions of the campaign. Once you select your mission and your loadout, you'll be on the battlefield, and once there, you'll be given objectives that will usually be something on the lines of destroy all enemies, destroy a certain enemy type, or hold out until X amount of time. While doing this, you'll be playing as one of 4 EDF soldier classes.
Ranger
Is supposedly the easiest class, as there aren't too many systems you have to worry about learning, while having the highest combat ability of all the other classes, and having a wide variety of weapons for any situation. Though at the start of the game, those last 2 things are very much so up for debate.
Wing Diver.
These are female soldiers capable of flight and using energy weapons. These weapons can be very varied, but a lot of the time they require using their energy gauge, which they use for flight as well. Their main weakness is that they have very little HP, and at the start of the game they're incredibly powerful, but later on they become very much so put in their place by tougher enemies that they can't deal with fighting head on, unless in very particular circumstances.
Air Raider.
These soldiers are very similar to the Ranger, except their main thing is that they provide support for the other classes. This support usually comes in the form of them calling down things such as tanks or airstrikes, and supposedly they're one of the hardest classes to use in the game, which makes sense since if you start playing single player, they're actually kinda hard to use effectively.
Fencer.
These soldiers are in heavy armor, allowing them to take up extra hits as opposed to the other classes. They can also equip 2 weapons at any given time, these being Gatling guns, missile launchers, and various cannons, along with shields they can use to protect themselves and melee weapons that can have secondary effects, usually shockwaves and energy slashes. While blasting through the hordes of kaiju with varying amounts of ease, they'll be dropping one of 3 things. Health pickups, which will be white and red and will restore your health, armor pickups, which will be big red boxes that at the end of the level, depending on the amount you found during the mission, will determine the amount of your max HP will increase by for that given class on that profile. And lastly, weapons, which will be in big green boxes, and at the end of the level, you will gain access to these weapons, with the quality and level of these weapons depending on the difficulty of the mission itself. And that's pretty much the main loop of the game. You go into missions, fight giant monsters, try not to die, while trying to collect all the red and green boxes that you can for progression's sake. The actual loop itself is fine, fighting enemies always feels really fun, and all the classes do feel varied, but these aren't the problems that I have with the game. First off, the game really leans into its multiplayer, so much so that the single player really isn't balanced difficulty-wise. A lot of the time you'll end up in missions where you're pretty much outgunned and can be easily swarmed, even with your NPC allies who will end up dying as the battle progresses if it goes for too long. Which admittedly is half the point of the game, but on certain levels it seems next to impossible to beat them on your first run-through on normal difficulty. Level 16 is a good example. I don't know how you're supposed to do that on normal difficulty by yourself on your first run-through. Secondly, the first hour of the game is kind of bad. There's no real tutorial to explain the controls to you, so you're pretty much stuck having to look at them in your options menu. And then when that's not happening, then you have to figure out that all the different characters have different control layouts depending on what they are. For example, the weapon swap button for the Fencer and the Wing Diver are actually different. And there are other things, like they don't explain to you how the boost system for the Fencer works, or what button you have to hit with the Air Raider to cause your grenades to detonate on the first default gun you get. Some of these things are explained during the loading screens, but the loading screens are random, so good luck with that. Speaking of RNG, weapons also fall into this category as you'll never know what kind of weapon you'll get. The only thing you really know is that the quality and level of the weapon will actually be higher depending on what the difficulty of the mission is. And if you're doing it by yourself, you're never going to get anything particularly amazing. And scouring the battlefield for armor and weapon pickups is downright tedious if you pick anything other than the Wing Diver, as all of the other classes are incredibly slow, especially the Lancer. And you really have to do this at the beginning of the game since you start off with so few weapons that you don't really have any of that cool variety that I mentioned earlier. Instead, you're stuck dealing with what you have to deal with until you get a reasonable arsenal. All of this results in you doing some very unsatisfying scavenging. The aspects that I brought up make the game feel very MMO-y, and whether you like that or not will really depend on your preference and if you have friends to play the game with you or not. Because if you're by yourself, it's not going to be a great time. Like I said, shooting aliens is fun, but it's more fun playing with friends since you can coordinate and do higher difficulties because you're not going to do anything above normal by yourself. So in short, the gameplay is good and definitely a lot better if you have friends. Otherwise, it's alright. Presentation-wise, the game can be bright and colorful depending on the location that you're going to. Most of the time you're going through different cityscapes. Sometimes you're going through neighborhoods, sometimes you're going through rural areas, sometimes you're going through downtown areas or parks, and sometimes you might find yourself on the beach staring down a horde of robots. And the game definitely runs at 60, and no, all the freezing that's going on in the video itself has nothing to do with the game. It's just my recording software not wanting to record it at a solid clip for some reason. When it comes to options in the video department, there really aren't that many. You can mess around with your shadows, your resolutions, and your anti-aliasing, but that's really about it. All the other options basically go into things such as rebinding the buttons for all your different classes, which thank goodness you can, and changing the language from English to Japanese, in case you want that authentic kaiju battling feel. On a sound front, the sound effects are used to great effect, especially when it comes to the weapons, making them feel way more impactful and satisfying to fire. Meanwhile, the soundtrack itself is, well, none of the music will stand out particularly well. It does help the game style come out, making battles more epic and suspenseful than usual. And lastly, the voice acting. It's not like it's particularly bad. The problem is that they won't Shut up. Battles involving civilians are complete cacophonies of screams and pleads for help. And this will not stop until the NPCs either despawn or are killed. And even if you kill all the enemies in the area, they'll continue to yell and scream in your ear. Meanwhile, the same thing applies for the soldiers that are with you. They'll continue to yell about EDF and battle cries. Meanwhile, if all the enemies in the area are killed, they'll still be talking. In short, the presentation is alright. It's nothing particularly groundbreaking, and it definitely tries to push itself by having physics going on with the bugs, with them being able to be broken up into pieces. That's actually kind of gross. And with the whole NPCs being there and yelling their heads off. But for the most part, it's okay. It doesn't add a whole lot, namely the screaming. And that's Earth Defense Force 4.1, The Shadow of New Despair. Would I recommend this game? Only if you have friends to play with you. Otherwise, just wait for a good Steam sale or get Earth Defense 4's Insect Armageddon, as that one's $9, and frankly its single player is way better than this, despite the 30 FPS frame rate. You can go online and play with random people, but 1, there's voice chat, so you have to deal with that, and 2, that's not what this game is about. The game is about teaming up with your friends to go fight giant monsters with the odds stacked against you with overpowered weaponry. While the game likes to explain its finer points through loading screens and you have to grow your arsenal from the teeny tiny one you start with, It really just makes the game a lot harder to pick up as opposed to making it bad to play, which I'm not gonna say isn't a problem, because it is a problem, especially since at first I thought about just panning this game after the first hour. But finding new weapons and figuring out how to use them effectively against the aliens is pretty darn fun. In short, it's like the actual EDF forces. If you want to be successful, don't go alone. Otherwise, you'll be swarmed by a bunch of bugs, and then you have to start the mission all over again. In short, it's an alright game, as long as you have backup.
I'm gonna be a hero.
That's good to say.
Hello again, thanks for watching. If you happen to like this sort of content, drop a like, comment, subscribe, and maybe tell a friend who also be interested in this sort of content. If you want more online cooperative shooters, then I heavily recommend Helldivers. It requires a lot of teamwork, but it's definitely rewarding to get these missions done. You can click on the left annotation and see my video on that. On the flip side, you can click on the right annotation and look at the last video I did for a game called Fury, which if you have any affinity towards action games, I would definitely recommend looking at.